You're listening to Innovators, the podcast from Harris Search Associates, where we speak with global leaders in education, research, engineering, and the health sciences, and ask them to share lessons learned as they continue to advance the frontiers of innovation and discovery. Today's podcast will be led by Rick Skinner, Senior Consultant.
For some of us old enough to remember, but still young enough to be able to remember, veterinary medicine conjures up scenes from the British television series, All Creatures Great and Small, and the adventures of a small veterinary practice in the 1930s in the Yorkshire Dales of England. The series spawned generations of young people who wanted to devote their lives to helping cows give birth, mending the wounds of dogs, and vaccinating sheep against a host of diseases. Bucolic images notwithstanding, veterinary medicine underwent the same revolution that human medicine did during the 20th century. A stronger scientific basis for diagnosis and treatment, antibiotics and other drugs that seemed almost magical in their capacity to eliminate infections that once led to death more often than not, and technologies that made it possible to identify causes of illness and the status of injuries, and enabled surgical and other kinds of treatment at the cellular and even deeper levels of life. The revolution in human medicine was paralleled and oftentimes made possible by the study and treatment of animals. Michael Lairmore is Distinguished Professor and Dean of the School of Veterinary Medicine at the University of California, Davis. Dr. Lairmore earned his Doctor of Veterinary Medicine from the University of Missouri, and then was in private practice until he completed a residency and a PhD in experimental pathology from Colorado State. One of very few veterinarians elected to the National Academy of Medicine, Dean Lairmore joined the University of California at Davis in 2011. By 2015, in 4 short years, the school was ranked #1 in the world and in the United States, and has consistently remained so ranked ever since. But as impressive as are his and his colleagues' achievements in veterinary medicine, Dean Lairmore's notion of what the purview of such a school is extends from clinical veterinary medicine to public health. His own research led to breakthroughs in the biology of human retroviruses and carcinogenetics. Welcome to Innovators, Dr. Lairmore.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rick.
From the time you began your graduate studies to earn your DMV, what have been the most important developments in your profession, particularly within academic research?
Well, thank you, Rick, for the opportunity to discuss developments in the veterinary profession and the role of veterinarians. I'm glad you mentioned James Herriot. He was the reason I started my career in dairy and small animal practice. I wanted to be James Herriot. In practice, I learned a lot of lessons, in particularly the role of veterinarians in the community. Mm-hmm. But as I transitioned to the graduate school work that you mentioned at Colorado State University, I had a strong desire to understand more deeply cattle, because I was interested in ruminants. But in graduate school, I was very fortunate. There was, at the time, a strong group studying sheep viruses. Mm-hmm. And these were a unique family of viruses that were infected with a retrovirus that were called lentiviruses, which are slow viruses. And the diseases caused by these type of viruses were known for decades, if not hundreds of years in the veterinary profession. And they cause chronic diseases of sheep and other species, including horses. But while I was in graduate school, we were in the laboratory when my advisor brought us a electron micrograph of a virus particle. Mm-hmm. And we all said, well, that's the sheep virus, because we knew the shape of it. But it turns out that was from a human dying of immunodeficiency disease in San Francisco. And that was when they first discovered that AIDS was caused by the same type of virus that I was studying in the laboratory. Yes. So as you can imagine, my world changed overnight. We were then brought into a world which needed to understand the knowledge and the information that we as veterinarians knew in the field of viruses. And that's how I got my job at the Centers for Disease Control. Mm-hmm. And I was immersed in that field, and really from there was very able to understand quite quickly how the knowledge and skills of veterinarians applied, and started my path down the study of tumor viruses, including human viruses that cause tumors, which I spent my career on. So these early exposures, I didn't know it, but was really in a subject called One Medicine. Back then, that was a term coined and incorporated later into what we now call One Health, which is an approach we're going to talk about.
Yep.
So I feel very fortunate now at UC Davis, which is a global leader in veterinary medicine and biomedical sciences and agriculture research. I'm like a kid in a candy shop. I'm employed in my dream job. And I have the privilege to see on a daily basis how these unique skills of veterinarians and really add to the understanding of both biology, but also importantly to the role and context of public health, the environment, especially where animals and people interface. That's some part of that concept of One Health, where we look at it in a broader context of that. And as you well know, this did not occur overnight. It was known in ancient times that healers of both humans and animals often practiced similar arts, and it was only much later that they became, in a sense, split, human and veterinary medicine. I might add that the public, they expect us to come together as scientists, and
Yes.
they have high expectations.
Yes.
They want us to protect human and animal health. And, we're challenged with this because of the number of times we see diseases that are emerging. For example, zoonotic diseases, those that cross over between animals and people, and sometimes back the other direction, but also in other fields, such as cancer, chronic diseases, such as heart disease. These are all things that are parallel between medical and the veterinary profession. So there's very much of an interest, a need, and the veterinary profession has, in multiple ways, is trying to meet that need through that One Health approach. We're sometimes limited. We're a smaller profession. We are training veterinarians for practice and in multiple areas in other fields as well, in public health, research, government. But we're sometimes limited just because of the nature of the lack of the number of veterinary schools to train veterinarians in this field.
Just take a minute, and I'm going to go back to the One Health concept. How much of that has been inhibited in your mind by the silos to this point? Has it severely restricted advances that we might otherwise have seen? And I know that's difficult to forecast.
The nature of specialization, as we became more specialized, for example, even at a school like ours, we have over 30 specialties that are recognized, become board certified. And same thing, of course, is in the medical profession. The value of that is that a subject very much in depth, and we can expect a cardiologist to know everything about the heart, for example. But the problem comes in is that many of the problems we face in our society that I mentioned, and we can get into, are really related to more complex issues.
Yes.
That involve multiple factors, multiple disciplines. So that One Health concept of transdisciplinary approaches to solve a single type problem aren't necessarily how people are trained. Veterinarians are. We often are trained to interact with people in agriculture, interact with the medical profession through our public health training. And so we're natural at leading teams together. And so we often find ourselves in a sense called to the problem in some cases, such as a foodborne illness outbreak. But in some cases, we're convincing our colleagues of our role in that equation. And many of them recognize it and actually incorporate veterinarians on panels to major interventions in areas where these problems exist. But we do find that sometimes we are knocking at the door and trying to get into the equation. But as you mentioned, there's a lot of examples. when we start to cite the examples in which the unique skill sets apply, people get it right away. I'm proud of the fact that veterinarians are trained in this way and try to break down those silos.
Mm-hmm. Just one more comment on that. Engineering, the discipline of engineering went through something very comparable where the fields such as electrical engineering and so forth, they began to get very siloed. And it was not until about 15 years ago when they came up with the concept of great challenges. In other words, they said, let's take on the big questions that we need to answer, regardless what our specialization is. But not only regardless, but in fact, we need all of us to answer the questions of how do you keep the world environmentally safe. So is there, in your mind, is there some point out there where those great challenges, as you call it, One Health, can break down those silos and allow the researchers and the physicians, the human physicians and the vets, that's the kind, might that bring together?
Those great challenges are some of those examples I mentioned. Mm-hmm. For example, in foodborne illness, if the common term mad cow disease is used to apply to that. That would be an example of a great challenge, immediate public concern, immediate interest in intervention. And that's an example where a coordinated effort is really absolutely critical. Mm-hmm. You not only need animal health diagnostics to properly diagnose the disease, but also immediately the questions come in about where did the disease happen? How did it occur? Epidemiologists need to be brought in, microbiologists, pathologists. And in all of these fields, you immediately get into the concern about public health. So you need obviously medical professionals, you need those that understand public health, and then work together to try to solve a problem like that. There are many examples like that, from Ebola virus
That's the one I was thinking
of. To situations where there is toxins in our environment. All of these are grand challenges. All of them require many disciplines. All of them required a coordinated effort and listening to each other. And that, in a sense, is that One Health approach.
That's fascinating. Let me take you a little bit closer to home. And just in the recent past, and now in the present, what are the areas of synergy between research in veterinary and research in human medicine? Looking back over the past quarter century, what were the major points of convergence? You mentioned AIDS, for example, that connected the two professions before the silos became a little too strong, a little too rigid. What were those?
Well, some of the major convergence that come to mind are areas where there is both basic and applied research, where veterinarians and the profession has played a leading role, but also some of those things we just mentioned, food safety, emerging diseases, zoonotic diseases, the human-animal bond is much well recognized. Things that are threatening to us, such as terrorism or bioterrorism. These are all areas where they naturally have converged in the last quarter century. The public and the federal sponsors of biomedical research have recognized this and have coined a term called translational medicine, which is really typically applied towards the improvement of human health. And in order to really accomplish translational medicine for animal or human health, taking those basic discoveries into real world treatments, you really need a broader team approach. And that does include veterinarians who understand animals and animal research as well. So some of the foundation for human knowledge related to that is definitely rooted in the knowledge and skill sets that veterinarians bring to animal research. Now, when we extend throughout the world, we're talking about global pandemics and how do we prevent those. A good example of on the side of watching out for how can we predict the next pandemic is a large USAID funded project that we house here at UC Davis, but involves collaborators all over the world in about 30 countries. And this project is, as the app name is implied, is predicting by screening. And what they do is they screen at that interface of animals in their environment, and they don't screen every animal. they screen those that are more likely to carry the disease, such as monkeys or rats. And it's an amazing project. They have discovered over 800 viruses in nature that were either not known or they were not known in those hosts. For example, recently, Tracy Goldstein isolated a virus called Bombali Ebola virus, which is a brand new strain of virus in Sierra Leone.
Is it mutated, essentially?
It is different. It is, and what the big question was is not only do we need to understand where they're being isolated, that they are different, but we also need to know the host species. And in this case, it was isolated to a particular bat. And subsequently, it was found that that bat carries the virus in multiple other locations in Africa. But that's an example where a federally funded project with the right team of investigators that are trained at the interface, meaning in the spots where the disease is likely to happen, are critical for that. And those unique skill sets that veterinary microbiologists and pathologists and teams around this One Health approach are critical, because if we can predict it in nature, we then can have a more efficient intervention and prevent it from so-called spillover into outside of the origin of the virus. So that's an example of a dramatic emerging disease that this approach really applies to.
You know, I must tell you, some of the points you made, I just want to note. Later, we have an interview on food security and safety, precisely because as we looked for you to talk about this, we kept coming over the fact that much of the work, a great deal of the work you're doing at UC Davis has to do with food security and safety. So it's striking, at least to me, and I think to us, that what's happening really calls for a convergence. The divergence doesn't serve anything other than probably vanity, that's all best I can tell. And at the same time, it has high potential risk. And I think that's the part that I think people will be nervous about. Let me, you mentioned early on something that I'm not sure many people are aware. There are dramatically more medical schools than there are veterinary schools, dramatically. And every day it seems like we get a note that another medical school. We don't hear about new veterinary schools. Back in 2009, you and a group of your colleagues made the case, and I'm going to quote here, that the number of veterinarians in the United States is inadequate to meet societal needs in biomedical research and public health. If the field of veterinary medicine plays a significant role in research, what were the constraints at that time that contributed to the shortage? Are the constraints still there?
And it's, I'm glad you asked that question. We did make that observation in 2009. It is still true to this day. There are only 30 veterinary schools currently accredited in the United States. And there are about another 20 that are accredited internationally. And we link those together through the American Association of Veterinary Medical Colleges, and I'm currently the president of that association. And this is on our minds on a daily basis of how do we meet societal needs. All of us are training veterinarians in skill sets that we know are important, as we mentioned, and it's well documented that veterinarians are needed. We have multiple issues related to that. One is the number of trained professionals. Some are geographic issues, such as why we can't get veterinarians, like physicians actually, in rural areas. Part of that is economically driven.
Exactly.
It is difficult to make a living when your patients are separated 100 miles. So we need to come up with better ways. Telehealth, telemedicine is another example of that. But the areas of greatest needs in terms of research, in terms of understanding, require further training. So once the veterinary degree is offered, we have to train further, either a board certification, like the medical professionals
Mhm.
or a master's or a PhD degree to be adequately trained in these areas and to approach the problems that we had mentioned. So graduate veterinarians face choices. Many of them do want to go into practice. We don't fault them for that. We understand that, but there are also great needs in our society. So we think about that a lot, and what we try to do is also encourage that through a variety of exposures. We just had last week over 500 veterinary students, all involved in research, at a conference we call the Veterinary Scholars Program. And this was held at Tufts University.
Mhm.
And this is a program that has really developed over the last decade to have our students paired with faculty members doing research or investigators at institutions such as NIH
Mhm.
to gain that training, to be exposed to research early in their career. I'm an example of that. I had
Yes.
a little exposure to a
Mhm.
small project in veterinary school, and it really inspired me to get further training and go into research. And we're doing that across the country. Now, that is a drop in a bucket compared to the need, but it is a definitely a start.
Exactly.
We do face a bit of a problem also with funding, like other types of research funding, training grants that are specifically targeted to these kind of professionals are fairly few.
Yes.
And we're trying to lobby through associations such as the AABMC, as I mentioned,
Mhm.
to express to the federal government the need for more funding and training grants in these areas that would really allow veterinarians to be part of these teams that we need. And you mentioned the global burden of disease. When we think globally, in particular, foodborne illnesses are a
Precisely.
great example. There are
Yes.
over 420 people that die every year from some sort of foodborne illness. And at the heart of that are the individuals that investigate these outbreaks through the animal health diagnostic systems.
Mhm.
So we are linked with federal programs across the diagnostic lab systems. We have an animal health and food safety system within California, for example, that's screening and investigating foodborne illness. That would be a clear example where there's a public need. There are systems set up, but sometimes the systems are not fully funding the trained professionals to go into these. So one approach is to incentivize them. One way to incentivize them is to encourage loan repayment programs
Mhm.
so they can
Precisely.
pay off their student debt, similar to the medical profession.
Right.
We lobby for these in Washington with our federal government. We have been successful. We have a loan repayment program for veterinarians that want to go into public health
Mhm.
or these areas of need, and that's helped a lot. I have to say the numbers of people in these loan repayment programs are relatively small, but they do have significant impact. So specialized training, loan repayment programs, working together with our medical colleagues in translational medicine to get further funding for those
Mhm.
kinds of programs.
Mhm.
These are all things that we're attempting to do in collaboration.
I'm curious. In a way, you were one of those students. You did your DVM, and then you went out and practiced for a while, and then you came back. I'm not asking for you to share your impoverished state at the time, but I am curious. At that point, you were foregoing income completely, unless the Ohio State managed to find some money for you. Is it that sort of dire financial choice that veterinarians are facing if they want to pursue a research?
Well, that is, you do have to forego some income because the residency programs,
Mhm.
the graduate programs certainly don't pay
Don't
the
pay very
same
well.
as what
No.
you do if you jump into practice. I had the fortunate exposure early on to understanding the role of research so that I looked at it as a investment. And at that time, my student loan debt was about the same as my income. So I only made about $18,000 a year coming out of school, had about $15,000 in student debt. But I was
Don't
able to
mention this to any of your students. Don't mention this.
Well, the point is higher education was supplemented back
Exactly.
then, whereas only about 20% of my current budget comes from the states. So in a sense, having a huge student loan is a deterrent for some students from choosing these careers. And that's why these loan repayment programs, that's why having early exposure to the benefits. Now, if they are able to do that, the jobs are very lucrative after that. So if you have, for example, a board certification in pathology or radiology, and you do decide to go into research, those are very lucrative jobs, but you do have to forgo a period of time, you're right, and in an impoverished state to succeed.
Last spring, when you were elected president of the American Association of Veterinary Medical Colleges, it was interesting to me that the annual meeting had a theme that said the science of building inclusive teams, which I thought that was a fascinating choice of terms, because I guess I had simply maybe assumed that for young people and young men and women, the lure of becoming a veterinarian would cut across race, ethnicity, and so forth. I gather it doesn't. And at the same time, we're placed in situations now where we're beginning to understand that diversity is not simply a morally good thing to do, it's an effective thing to do because it brings about better decision making. What's the issue here that makes diversity something that you and your colleagues are going to have to take on in the association?
That's a great question and very relevant to today, as you mentioned. Those traits that make veterinarians leaders in some of these One Health approaches, where they do need to work in teams, they have this unique skill sets to enable them to do that. But you don't need, the skill sets alone are not going to cut it. So in order to serve the society that we need to serve, in the communities that we need to serve, we need to have a diverse workforce. And this is recognized really across the profession. And the current state of the profession is very attuned to that. The AAVMC and our individual school, like a lot of the universities, have affirmed, as you mentioned, the value of diverse teams. So they have to work together, but they also need to understand their communities. And so the membership is committed to this in a belief, and that's followed by action. Unfortunately, the veterinary profession is not as diverse as we need to be. This was recognized almost over a decade ago with efforts at the national level through groups like the AAVMC, which formed programs and hired people in a program called Diversity Matters. And Diversity Matters has now had major metric improvements in the profession. We currently stand about 17.4% underrepresented minority students in the profession. That's not enough, but it is dramatically better than it was in 2005 when that program launched. So what do? They do everything from career fairs, information. They reach out to diverse communities to help us recruit at the university level. They have done culture and climate studies to understand why individuals do or do not apply to the profession. And then we have annual conferences, which include diversity as a major theme.
Dean Lairmore, I think I know why you, number one, were elected president of the association, and two, I think I know why your program in your school are ranked number one in the world. Thank you very much for your time, and keep going in what you're doing. You're doing, as we say in the South, the Lord's work.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate your time and to be able to tell our stories on Innovators. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Innovators, a production of Harris Search Associates. We'll have more insightful conversations with global thought leaders to follow.